I wrote Beautiful God with my friend James Teeley, who's actually my neighbor. He and his wife live up the street just a few houses, and he's an incredible songwriter and a gifted worship leader. And when we get together and write, a lot of times as worship leaders, what we're trying to do is connect our congregations to what God has been doing in our churches. And for this song, we really wanted to capture those sweet, intimate moments that sometimes happen in a worship service where you can just tell that God's presence is there in a very real and almost tangible way. And what can you do in that moment except just acknowledge, God, I know that you're here, and all I can do is just worship you and pour out my heart in worship. And a lot of times that can be a vulnerable moment because we're confronted with our sins and our shortcomings and the ways that we've let the people around us down. And that's natural, because when you're confronted with God's bigness and God's perfection, it just, there's something about that it's hard to feel anything but small in that moment. But the good news is that because of Jesus' sacrifice, we get to enjoy the life that he brought with him when he was resurrected out of the tomb. And we're no longer bound to those mistakes and those shortcomings. And the Bible gives us the most incredible picture that we get to implement into our lives through baptism. You know, thinking about this song, I keep going back to this moment that happened on the day that me and Hannah got married. I was standing backstage with my pastor, Pastor Dan, and all of my groomsmen were out front seating guests, and my best man, Josh Wilson, was like walking my grandmother down the aisle or something like that. So it was just me and my pastor backstage, and I was starting to get nervous because the ceremony was going to start soon. And I just asked him to, in a way, to cut the silence, like, well, you got any last minute advice before we do this? And he just looked at me very thoughtfully and said, well, you have no idea what you're doing. And I was just flabbergasted, because that was not in any way the answer that I expected. And he must have seen it on my face, because he smiled and he said, but right now you really have no way of knowing what you're about to enter into, because it's so much more than just a contract between you and another person. You and Hannah are about to make a covenant before God and with God, and he's going to use this moment to bind your lives together in a way that's supernatural. And you won't be able to put words to it, but looking back over your shoulder in the future, you'll be able to see that God has taken your lives and he has intertwined them in a way that's inseparable, that only he can do. And in a lot of ways, I think that baptism is one of those moments, because while it's certainly symbolic and it's a part of our profession of faith before others, I think that God uses that moment to do something transformative in our hearts. And it's not that there's anything about the water that saves us, but in that act of obedience, where we say, I'm going to participate in the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus Christ, God uses that moment to do something very special and supernatural and unexplainable in our hearts. And he creates a landmark where we can look back on our lives and say, from this moment forward, I'm going to live a resurrected life with Jesus Christ. So my hope and prayer for this song is that churches around the country and around the world can sing it together and acknowledge God's presence and acknowledge his goodness, and not have to feel fear or shame or guilt in those moments. That we can stand confidently in his presence and say, God, thank you for transforming me. Thank you for making me worthy to be in your presence. You are a wonderful, beautiful God.
Again, beautiful God, in this place, you are drawing us close to you.